For years, Eleanor Whitmore had mastered the art of silence. Not the kind of silence born from fear, but the kind cultivated through patience, restraint, and observation. In rooms where voices overlapped and egos collided, she learned to lower her gaze and say nothing. In family gatherings where decisions were made without her consent, she nodded politely. In meetings where documents were slid across the table for her signature, she listened, smiled faintly, and signed where they told her to. That silence became her reputation. She doesn't argue. She doesn't understand the details. She's grateful just to be included. That was the version of Eleanor everyone believed in. They never asked themselves why she stayed quiet. The courtroom was already half full when she arrived that morning. Wood-paneled walls, rows of polished benches, the faint echo of murmured conversations bouncing off the high ceiling. It was the kind of room that carried history in its structure. Decisions made here had ruined lives, restored fortunes, rewritten family legacies. Eleanor walked in slowly, dressed in a simple navy coat, her hair pulled back neatly. No jewelry except a thin gold wedding band she never removed. Her expression was calm, almost detached, as if this were just another appointment on her calendar. Across the aisle, her family had already gathered. Her eldest son, Richard, sat in the front row with his wife beside him, leaning close as they whispered to each other. Their lawyer sat confidently at the end of the bench, flipping through a thick binder with practiced ease. A few seats behind them, Eleanor's younger daughter avoided eye contact entirely, staring straight ahead as if the floor held something fascinating. No one stood when Eleanor entered. No one acknowledged her presence beyond a brief glance. "She's still pretending she doesn't know what's going on," Richard muttered under his breath, loud enough for his wife to hear. She smiled faintly in response. Eleanor took her seat alone on the opposite side of the aisle. She folded her hands in her lap and waited. This case had been building for years. After her husband's death, the family had moved quickly. Too quickly, Eleanor thought at the time. Meetings were called, papers prepared, signatures requested. They told her it was all routine, all necessary, all in her best interest. "You don't need to worry about this," Richard had said more than once. "It's complicated legal stuff," his wife added, always with that same reassuring tone. "We'll take care of everything." Eleanor had nodded. She always nodded. What they never noticed was how carefully she read every page before signing, how she asked quiet questions no one took seriously, how she kept copies of documents they assumed she didn't understand, how she remembered dates, clauses, names. They mistook her silence for ignorance. That mistake would cost them everything. The judge entered the courtroom, and everyone rose. As proceedings began, Eleanor's family took control of the narrative immediately. Their attorney spoke confidently, outlining years of necessary management of Eleanor's assets, explaining how decisions had been made on her behalf due to her limited involvement and preference for non-participation. In other words, she had chosen to be silent. "She has always trusted her family to act in her best interest," the lawyer said smoothly. "She never objected." Eleanor did not look up. She did not interrupt. She did not react. That silence reassured them. Richard leaned back slightly, arms crossed, already certain of the outcome. His wife glanced toward Eleanor once, her lips curling into a small, almost amused smile. "She won't say anything," she whispered. "She never does." Witness after witness was called, accountants, advisors, even distant relatives, each reinforcing the same story. Eleanor had been passive. Eleanor had deferred. Eleanor had stayed silent while others acted for her, and Eleanor let them talk. The judge finally turned his attention toward her side of the courtroom. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, his voice neutral but attentive, "do you have legal representation today?" Eleanor lifted her head for the first time. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied calmly. A murmur rippled through the room. Her family exchanged quick glances. Her lawyer had arrived quietly earlier, sitting behind her rather than beside her. He stood now, adjusting his jacket, and nodded respectfully toward the judge. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Very well, you may proceed when ready." Eleanor's lawyer did not begin immediately. Instead, Eleanor herself stood. The room stilled. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The shift in energy, the sudden awareness that something unexpected was happening. Eleanor walked forward with measured steps, stopping just short of the witness stand. "For years," she began, her voice steady, "I was told that my silence meant consent." Richard's jaw tightened. Eleanor continued, eyes forward, unwavering, that it meant trust, that it meant ignorance. She paused, letting the words settle. But silence, she said, is not the same as surrender. Her lawyer placed a single folder on the table, thick, labeled, organized. The first crack appeared on Richard's face. Eleanor turned slightly, finally looking toward her family. Not with anger, not with accusation, with clarity. I stayed silent because I was watching, she said. And I remembered everything. The judge leaned forward. The courtroom held its breath, and for the first time since the case began, Eleanor's family realized that her silence had never been weakness. It had been preparation. The moment Eleanor finished speaking, the courtroom no longer felt predictable. It wasn't dramatic shouting or sudden chaos, far from it. The shift was quieter, heavier, the kind of tension that settled into people's chests when they realized the story they believed was incomplete. Eleanor returned to her seat slowly, her posture unchanged, her expression composed. She did not look back at her family again. She didn't need to. Their unease was audible in the rustling of papers, the whispered exchanges, the stiff way Richard adjusted his tie as if it suddenly felt too tight around his neck. Her lawyer stepped forward. "Your Honor," he began calmly, "my client has indeed remained silent for many years. What she did not do was remain uninformed." He opened the folder Eleanor had placed on the table. Inside were documents spanning more than a decade, copies of contracts, amendments, correspondence, bank statements, and internal memos. Each page was carefully tabbed, each section labeled. The opposing lawyer's confident posture shifted almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Whitmore," the judge said, "you're claiming that despite your lack of objection at the time, you were fully aware of the decisions being made on your behalf?" "Yes, Your Honor," Eleanor replied, "and I objected, in writing." That single sentence sent a murmur through the room. Richard turned sharply toward her. "That's not true," he blurted out before catching himself. The judge raised a hand. "You'll have an opportunity to respond, Mr. Whitmore." Eleanor's lawyer nodded. "If I may, Your Honor." He lifted the first document. "This is a copy of a letter sent by Mrs. Whitmore to the family's legal counsel 11 years ago. It questions the restructuring of her late husband's holdings and explicitly requests clarification on ownership transfers." He handed the copy to the clerk. The opposing lawyer frowned. "We have no record of that letter." "That's because," Eleanor's lawyer replied evenly, "it was never entered into your files, but it was received." He turned another page. "And this is the acknowledgement of receipt, signed by your firm." The courtroom went silent. Richard's wife leaned toward him, whispering urgently. He shook his head, eyes fixed on the document now displayed on the judge's monitor. Eleanor watched none of it. Her gaze rested on the far wall as if the outcome no longer needed her attention. The judge studied the screen carefully. "This acknowledgement appears legitimate." "It is," Eleanor said quietly. "I kept copies of everything." Her son exhaled sharply through his nose, a sound somewhere between disbelief and frustration. "This doesn't change anything," the opposing lawyer said, regaining composure. "Mrs. Whitmore may have asked questions, but she still signed the final agreements. Consent was given." "Yes," Eleanor's lawyer replied. "Consent obtained under deliberate omission." He opened another section of the folder. "For years, my client was presented with documents labeled as administrative. What she was not given were the attached schedules, pages that detailed the reassignment of controlling interests." The judge looked up. "Are you suggesting material pages were withheld?" "I'm stating it as fact," the lawyer said, "and we have proof." One by one, documents were placed into evidence. Incomplete packets, missing appendices, emails referencing attachments that Eleanor was never provided. Richard's wife's face paled. "That's ridiculous," she muttered. "She didn't even ask for those." Eleanor finally turned her head. "I did," she said. "You just didn't answer." Her voice was calm, not accusatory, certain. The judge leaned back slightly, folding his hands. "Mrs. Whitmore, why didn't you pursue this earlier? Why wait until now?" It was the question everyone had been silently asking. Eleanor stood again. "When my husband died," she said, "I was told that grieving women make poor decisions, that it was better for me to rest, to trust, to let my children handle the burden." She paused. "I believed them," she continued, "but belief doesn't erase awareness." She turned toward the bench, meeting the judge's eyes directly. "I waited because I needed time to understand what was taken, time to gather proof, time to see who benefited from my silence." Her lawyer stepped in. "And during that time, Your Honor, my client never transferred her legal ownership." He placed one final document on the table. "This is the original trust agreement. Clause 14b clearly states that no redistribution of controlling assets can occur without informed consent and independent legal counsel." The opposing lawyer stiffened. "She waived that requirement." Eleanor's lawyer shook his head. "She never did." He pointed to the signature line. "That waiver was signed by Mr. Richard Whitmore, acting as executor, but not by Mrs. Whitmore herself." Richard stood abruptly. "That's a technicality." The judge's gaze snapped to him. "Sit down, Mr. Whitmore." Richard froze, then complied. The courtroom felt smaller now, as if the walls themselves were leaning in. Eleanor's lawyer continued. "For years, my client's silence was interpreted as agreement. In reality, it was restraint." He turned slightly toward Eleanor. She watched her children restructure assets they didn't own. She watched advisors justify actions that violated the trust. She watched people mistake her composure for confusion. Eleanor clasped her hands together. "I stayed silent," she said, "because I needed them to believe I was powerless." The judge exhaled slowly. "And now?" he asked. Eleanor lifted her chin. "Now," she said, "I'm ready for the final hearing." Her family sat frozen. The case they thought was settled was unraveling, thread by thread, and for the first time, the silence Eleanor had carried for years no longer protected them. It protected her. The judge called for a short recess. It wasn't announced as a pause to reconsider anything, but everyone in the room understood what it meant. The foundation of the case had shifted, and the court needed air, time to let facts settle where assumptions once lived. Eleanor remained seated. She did not move, did not reach for water, did not turn to her lawyer. Her stillness had become her signature. It unsettled people more than any outburst ever could. Across the aisle, Richard leaned close to his attorney, whispering urgently. His wife stared straight ahead, her jaw clenched, fingers digging into the leather of her purse, as if grounding herself to something solid. Their son paced 2 steps, then stopped when an officer glanced his way. For years, Eleanor had watched moments like this from the outside. Private meetings, hushed conversations, decisions made without her presence. Now she watched them unravel in plain sight. When court resumed, the room felt heavier. The judge returned with a different expression, not accusatory, not sympathetic, focused. "Before we proceed," he said, "I want clarity on one issue." He looked directly at Eleanor. "Mrs. Whitmore, during the years these asset reallocations occurred, were you ever provided independent legal counsel, as required by the trust?" "No, Your Honor," Eleanor replied. "Were you advised at any point that you had the right to contest or delay these decisions?" "No." "Were you told that refusing to sign would result in legal consequences or family conflict?" Eleanor paused. "Yes," she said. "Repeatedly." The judge nodded slowly. He turned to the opposing counsel. "Is the court correct in understanding that Mrs. Whitmore's silence was treated as acquiescence, despite these omissions?" The lawyer hesitated for half a second too long. "That is how the family proceeded," he answered carefully. The judge did not miss the wording. "So," the judge continued, "not how the law proceeded." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Eleanor's lawyer stood again, his voice measured but firm. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, we would like to introduce testimony from a former associate of the Whitmore family office." Richard's head snapped up. "That's unnecessary." The judge raised a hand. "Sit down." A woman stepped forward. She was in her early 40s, professionally dressed, her expression controlled but tight around the eyes. She took the oath and sat. "Please state your name for the record," Eleanor's lawyer said. "Margaret Hale," the woman replied, "former compliance officer for Whitmore Holdings." Richard's wife inhaled sharply. The lawyer continued. "Ms. Hale, during your tenure, were you involved in reviewing asset transfers related to the Whitmore Trust?" "Yes." "Did you raise concerns regarding the legality of those transfers?" "Yes." The courtroom grew still. Margaret's hands folded tightly in her lap. "I raised concerns that Mrs. Whitmore had not been properly informed," she said. "That full documentation had not been disclosed." "And how were those concerns received?" Margaret hesitated. "They were dismissed," she said. "I was told Mrs. Whitmore was comfortable not knowing the details." Eleanor did not react. Her son stared at the witness, his face draining of color. Did anyone instruct you to limit what Mrs. Whitmore received? The lawyer asked. Margaret swallowed. Yes. Who? She glanced toward Richard. Him. The word landed like a dropped plate. Richard stood. This is outrageous. The judge's voice cut through the room. Sit down, Margaret continued. I was told not to overwhelm her, that she trusted the family, that pushing documents might confuse her. Eleanor closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in pain, in recognition. Her lawyer asked the next question gently. Did you document these instructions? Yes. He nodded and handed a flash drive to the clerk. These emails were preserved. The judge turned to the screen as messages appeared. Short, professional, unmistakable. Let's keep this simple for Eleanor. No need to send full schedules. She won't question it. The room went silent. Richard's wife covered her mouth. Their son stared at the floor. The judge leaned forward. Ms. Hale, he said, why are you testifying now? Margaret's voice wavered, just slightly. Because I was terminated after insisting on compliance, and because silence made me complicit. She looked toward Eleanor. I'm sorry it took so long. Eleanor opened her eyes. She nodded once. That was all. The judge dismissed the witness and sat back, hands steepled. This court is no longer examining a misunderstanding, he said. We are examining a pattern. He turned to Eleanor. Mrs. Whitmore, did you continue monitoring these activities after Ms. Hale's departure? Yes, Eleanor replied. How? Eleanor stood. I requested annual summaries, she said. I compared them. I tracked discrepancies. She paused. I also recorded conversations. A ripple of shock moved through the room. Richard's lawyer stiffened. Your Honor, in jurisdictions where one-party consent applies, Eleanor said calmly, those recordings are lawful. Her lawyer nodded. And admissible. The judge exhaled slowly. Proceed. The audio played. Richard's voice filled the courtroom, confident, dismissive. She doesn't need to know every number. She won't challenge it. She stayed quiet this long. The sound cut off. No one moved. Eleanor's son squeezed his eyes shut. The judge looked at Richard. You described your mother as incapable, he said evenly. Yet she documented years of misconduct while you underestimated her. Richard said nothing. The judge turned back to Eleanor. You waited, he said. Why? Eleanor answered without hesitation. Because power reveals itself when it thinks it's safe. Her lawyer stepped forward again. Your Honor, we are requesting immediate suspension of the current asset control structure and a full forensic audit of the trust's administration. The opposing lawyer stood. That would be excessive. The judge looked at him. No, he said. What would be excessive is ignoring what this court has now seen. He turned to Eleanor. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, the court recognizes that your silence was not submission. It was strategy. Eleanor did not smile. She simply sat down. Outside the courtroom, reporters were already gathering. Inside, a family that had relied on her quiet was realizing something too late. Silence, when chosen, is not weakness. It is preparation. The courtroom was no longer merely attentive, it was transformed. What had begun as a procedural dispute had become something far more dangerous, an exposure. The kind that doesn't just alter outcomes, but dismantles reputations. The judge sat in silence for several seconds after the final audio recording ended. He did not rush. He allowed the weight of what had been revealed to settle into the room, to press against every person who had underestimated the woman sitting quietly at the defense table. Then he spoke. This court will reconvene for final consideration. The words were simple, but their meaning was unmistakable. Eleanor remained seated. She did not clasp her hands. She did not bow her head. She simply waited, just as she had for years. Richard's attorney stood again, his voice strained beneath professional restraint. Your Honor, while certain communications may appear troubling, they do not conclusively establish intent. The family acted under the assumption. The judge raised his hand. No, he said firmly. The court will not accept assumptions as justification for the systematic exclusion of a beneficiary from her legal rights. He turned toward Eleanor. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, you are the sole surviving beneficiary of this trust. The evidence presented demonstrates repeated and deliberate efforts to obscure information, restrict access, and redirect authority without your informed consent. He paused. In simpler terms, this court finds that your silence was exploited. A murmur rippled through the gallery. Richard's wife lowered her head. Their son stared straight ahead, his expression hollow. The judge continued. This court orders the immediate suspension of all individuals currently exercising control over the Whitmore Trust. Richard stood abruptly. You can't... Sit down, the judge said sharply, or you will be removed. Richard sank back into his chair. The court further orders a full forensic audit, the judge said, conducted by an independent third party, with all findings reported directly to this bench. He looked at Eleanor again. Effective immediately, Mrs. Whitmore. All administrative authority over the trust reverts to you. The room froze, not because people didn't understand the words, but because they did. The judge's voice softened slightly. You were treated as irrelevant, he said. This court finds that treatment unjustified, unlawful, and damaging. He glanced toward Richard and his counsel. Based on the evidence presented, this court refers the matter to the District Attorney's Office for review of potential fiduciary misconduct, coercion, and financial misrepresentation. The sound that followed was not applause. It was breath, a collective exhale. Eleanor closed her eyes for a brief moment, not in relief, in completion. The judge struck the gavel. Court is adjourned. The sound echoed. Outside the courtroom, cameras flashed as the doors opened. Reporters surged forward, voices overlapping. Mrs. Whitmore, did you expect this outcome? Richard Whitmore, will you respond to the allegations? Is the family trust under criminal investigation? Eleanor walked slowly, flanked by her attorney, her posture calm. She did not answer questions. She did not look toward Richard. She did not need to. Inside the building, Richard stood frozen, his attorney whispering urgently into his ear. His wife trembled, her carefully curated composure gone. Their son lingered behind them, already aware that something irreversible had happened. That afternoon, the court's orders went into effect. Bank accounts were frozen, access privileges revoked, documents seized, emails archived. What had once been a private family structure became a matter of public record. Within days, auditors uncovered layers of irregularities, unapproved reallocations, undocumented transfers, advisory overrides, signed without disclosure. The story spread, not as scandal, as caution. Widow reclaims trust after years of silence, one headline read. Another was simpler. She was never powerless. The district attorney announced a formal inquiry. Former associates came forward. Margaret Hale was not the only one who had raised concerns and been dismissed. Patterns emerged, so did consequences. Richard resigned from the board of Whitmore Holdings. His professional network evaporated quietly, efficiently. The invitations stopped. The calls went unanswered. Silence returned, but this time it belonged to him. 6 months later, Eleanor sat at a small desk in her study, reviewing the final audit report. Her lawyer stood nearby. It's done, he said. The trust is fully restored. Compensation for losses has been approved. Eleanor nodded. She signed the final document with steady hands. What will you do now? He asked. Eleanor looked out the window. The garden beyond was in bloom. I'll decide, she said. That evening, Eleanor attended a modest community event. Nothing formal, no speeches, no announcements. Just people, conversations, quiet acknowledgements. A woman approached her. I followed your case, she said softly. You gave me courage. Eleanor smiled. Not widely, not performatively. Just enough. Months passed. The investigation concluded. Charges were filed. Settlements reached. Policies revised. But Eleanor did not dwell on outcomes. She had spent too many years being underestimated to define herself by reaction. One afternoon she returned to the courthouse, not as a litigant, as a guest. A new compliance seminar was being held, mandatory for fiduciaries overseeing trusts involving elderly beneficiaries. Her story was referenced, not by name, by lesson. Silence, when misunderstood, becomes dangerous. But when chosen, it becomes unstoppable. Eleanor listened from the back of the room, unnoticed, just as she preferred. As she left, a young clerk held the door open. Thank you, Eleanor said. The clerk hesitated, then smiled. No, she replied. Thank you. Outside, Eleanor paused. She breathed in the air, free, not because she had won, but because she had reclaimed what had always been hers. Her voice, her authority, her power, and no one would ever mistake her silence again. They thought her silence meant weakness, but silence, when chosen, becomes power. If this story spoke to you, Stay with us. Subscribe and let the next truth unfold.